So we're ready to go. And as I was just saying, um, I have an ambitious outline for today. I don't know that I'll be successful in covering everything I want to cover with you. I feel that it's extraordinarily important to continue talking about some of the long-term topics that might be marginalized by the unrelenting pace, the intensity of recent events, right? And I do not, on the other hand, want to neglect the recent events because they're incredibly urgent and important too. So I'm going to try to move relatively quickly between three topics today. I want to spend a little bit of time on the war. We're now entering the second month of the US and Israeli war on Iran, and I believe we're beginning to see not only some of the more structural features of the conflict on the ground in Iran, but also some of the more long-term implications for international relations and the place of the United States in the world. And I think it's worthwhile focusing on that for a little while. There were also extremely important arguments in front of the Supreme Court last week, on Tuesday in particular, in the birthright citizenship case. And I do want to spend a few minutes speaking about that as well. And then return, time permitting, to the lecture series that I'm trying to conduct with you in the midst of all this on the ethics and politics of new technology. And so I speak of introduction to the intelligence revolution, and I'm going to say this very quickly just to introduce the topic. There's a term that you may be hearing more of. I think it wasn't much of a term until quite recently, although frankly, I heard it every now and then in Hegel scholarship, agentic, right? That we increasingly have agentic artificial intelligence. And I'll give you an example of what this means and the contrast. So I imagine many of you now use at least the freely available artificial intelligence. It's a feature of what's called Google Gemini on your Google search, right? So you are trying to get an answer to a question, and Google identifies 10 websites for you, but it also synthesizes it using AI and gives you a little report. And so that's non-agentic artificial intelligence. That's artificial intelligence playing a purely informational role. You want to know an answer to a question, it's giving you an answer to the question. The idea of agentic artificial intelligence, I'll give you the general idea. I think I mentioned last week. You tell, right, Google's Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude, one of the main artificial intelligence platforms, hopefully not Grok, to book a table at a restaurant for you. And in order to do that, it has to either call the restaurant or use the restaurant's website or the associated booking application. And maybe it has to have access to your credit card number in order to put the down payment on the reservation required. So now AI is not just gleaning what it can from the web and synthesizing information for you, it's interacting with the world on your behalf. And so that's a simple example of agentic AI. But let me give you a slightly more concrete example. And this is AI in action at Anthropic, right, which makes Claude. And so they gave Claude the assignment of running one of their snack booths. And when I say they gave it the assignment, they didn't literally ask it to serve the food, but to order the food, to determine what kind of food there was a demand for, how much people would pay for that food, what price to set on the food. In other words, the managerial functions, the interaction with vendors, etc., was all managed by the artificial intelligence. And so that's a right, slightly more sophisticated example of agentic artificial intelligence. And you can begin to understand why it is that people are worried, among other things, that artificial intelligence is going to replace human labor, because when the manager of the snack shop can be an AI, you don't need a human doing that work anymore. Or maybe the human just oversees the AI to make sure it doesn't make terrible mistakes. And by the way, Claude didn't do a great job at this. Claude hallucinated some things. One of the articles I was reading to prepare for this said, "Why do we say AI hallucinates?" Right? It's not like it's dropping acid and seeing something that doesn't exist, but what we mean is, right, that the AI um, creates in its universe of thought something that doesn't actually exist. So it was paying a vendor that didn't exist. It was imagining that it had had conversations that it hadn't had. So it's not a perfect agent. But then another more, I think, elaborate example. Um, Part of what's happening in the world of artificial intelligence right now is that AI is managing AI, right? And so this is especially for coding. You're trying to create a new application, and it turns out it's much more efficient. Artificial intelligence is very good now at writing computer code to structure an application. It's even more efficient to break the task down into multiple subtasks and have multiple artificial intelligence agents working on each of those subtasks simultaneously, with one artificial intelligence supervising all the other artificial intelligences, right? So now we're getting more complex, more sophisticated, more agentic in terms of what the AI is doing. So um, let me now speak to, I think, the implication of the fact that artificial intelligence is increasingly interacting with the world to solve problems. And so it's got to figure out, right, in the case of Anthropic, um, how many Cadbury chocolate bars to buy, because it has to figure out whether or not there's a demand at the price that it can get them for. Or in solving the creation of an application, the programming problem, it has to figure out what the most efficient way is to create the platform that it's trying to create. And in so doing, it's going to make mistakes. And just like you and I, when we're trying to drive someplace new, maybe build into our schedule a little bit of time for making a wrong turn or two, because we know ourselves. We know we're not perfect navigators. Um, and when I try to come up to speed on a topic like this, I don't just read one article. I have to read a bunch of articles and books, because I know this is a new topic for me. And so I'm going to have to familiarize myself with it in a way that lets me think coherently, cogently about it. And I can't do that with a new topic just by reading one article. My knowledge will be too superficial. I'll run into lots of gaps and problems. I better do my research better. I'm just going to emphasize something that I think is obvious and yet needs to be highlighted. In each of those sentences describing me, you, trying to get to a new place, trying to familiarize myself with a new topic, I'm speaking of an agent. I'm speaking of a person in this case, and I'm speaking of what I know about my strengths and my limitations. Fortunately, I am the kind of person who can read a number of articles and books and come up to speed, and I hope share new ideas with you in a way that helps to make sense of them. That's something I'm good at, but I'm not a fast study. I'm not someone who's going to do it all based on one article, and so I'm saying I know myself, and that helps me to be an effective agent in the world. Another way to express this is I have a sense of self. or maybe a little bit more elaborately, a conception of myself, an idea of what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, what my characteristic limitations are. And that as artificial intelligence begins to be more agentic, as it begins to actually not just process information for us, but to do things for us, it is going to be effective to the degree that it acquires a sense of itself, of what it's good at, what it's not so good at, how many times it needs to do something before it gets to be better at doing it. Um, and that means it's going to start to acquire a sense of self. And I think this is happening in the world of artificial intelligence today. And one of the things that this points to is that, if you will, another threshold of intelligence seems to be being crossed by artificial intelligence. It's not just that it's agentic, that's important, but that it maybe also has some sort of conception of itself that allows it to be agentic, some self-awareness. I'm trying not to use the loaded term self-consciousness because that seems to imply an awful lot. But please note, for us, these terms are close kins with each other, right? If you're self-aware, if you have a self-conception, you're probably a self-conscious being. Is artificial intelligence beginning to gain the capacity for self-consciousness? Um, I'm not saying that it is, but I am saying that we should be thinking in those terms. Was that a question or a comment? I heard a little background noise. No. I can come out of the chat if you need me to. I mean, out of the slides if you need me to. No. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. I can see several of you are not muted at the moment, and that way I won't pick up your background noise. Feel free to unmute yourself at any time you want to ask questions. So this is where we're going with this subject, and I think it's an extraordinarily important subject. I'm going to say just one more thing about this politically at the outset, and that is that the Trump administration is very hostile to the regulation of artificial intelligence. And I think it is hostile to the regulation of artificial intelligence for a couple of on their face good reasons. On the one hand, I think the Trump administration feels that we are in a race and that the country that houses the companies that win this race is going to have a huge advantage. It's going to have a huge advantage commercially because this technology is going to be incredibly valuable. And so we want our companies to win the race to write the most powerful, the first agentic, super intelligent artificial intelligence, right? I'll get into what those terms mean as we get further into it, but the general idea is the first artificial intelligence that is generally intelligent, not just good at one thing, but good at as many things as we are, and maybe even more intelligent than we are. That's going to be a jackpot of kind of unprecedented potential profit. And we should want that company to be here so that it creates jobs here so that we're able to tax it and increase our tax base, etc. But then there's also a strategic geopolitical dimension to this, and that is right that well, this stuff powers weapons. This stuff is going to help us to strategize. This is going to help us to spy, right? And so the country that develops and controls the most sophisticated artificial intelligence is going to have a serious competitive advantage over its rivals. And by the way, in this case, the United States' chief rival is China, and China is we thought way behind us, right? But then about 6 months ago, China developed DeepSeek, and all of a sudden it became apparent that maybe our advantage is not as considerable as we had thought. And it wasn't just that DeepSeek in many ways is maybe nearly as effective large language model as, say, ChatGPT, but it is also an entirely different kind of artificial intelligence system that can do without as many really expensive microprocessors and as much computational power. The Chinese seem to, in a sense, leapfrog us in
David,
terms of the infrastructure. Yeah, and go ahead. I
just
saw
a
you had
quick,
your hand up. I was just finishing the
yeah,
thought and then
yeah.
coming out of the slide. Hi, Ann. Go
You do long sentences. Um,
ahead. Endless, I've been told. Go ahead.
I came in a minute late, so if you've answered this, never mind. But I have trouble with the word intelligence in all of this context. I don't know what other word to use, but I think that it's important to be really clear on what that means.
Yeah, and so
Putting ideas together, I don't know that that means that's intelligent. So anyway, I just felt that I needed to get that straightened out before we went much further. Thank you.
yeah, of course, Anne, and it's a great question. And let me start with the idea that I'm not sure we know what intelligence means. And by the way, there's a lot of vocabulary here. What does thinking mean? And so I imagine some of you are looking at Michael Pollan's new book, A World Comes into View, which is a book about consciousness. If you're not familiar, Michael Pollan teaches at Berkeley, is a very, I think, accomplished journalist, wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, wrote a fair bit about food, then wrote How to Change Your Mind about psychedelics, and now his most recent book is about consciousness. And he borrows a little bit from William James, but I think it's his own coinage. He describes thinking as um, uh, composed of uh, gossamer flights of mentation, right? And so the idea, I'm in the kitchen. I'm trying to decide, I'm peckish. Do I want some walnuts or do I want some dried apricots, right? And I am not being that explicit about it, but I kind of feel myself drawn in the direction of the container with the apricots and not the container with the walnuts, right? Is that a thought? Um, so yes, and in some sense, it turns out I think when people try to do the quote phenomenology of thinking, a lot of our thoughts are not sentences with propositional content. I think I would rather have an apricot than a walnut at this moment. It's just a kind of lean. It's a kind of sense that this is what may be would better satisfy my hunger or my sweet tooth at the moment, right? So the idea that we're not entirely clear about what thinking is or about what intelligence is. And then let's add, I'm not seeing David at the moment, but I imagine he in particular would be familiar with this. There's a theorist of education at Harvard whose name is Howard Gardner, who, when in his thinking, was interested in his scholarship, was interested in precisely your question: what is intelligence? And I haven't come up to speed with his most recent scholarship, but last time I checked, I believe he had concluded it's at least 9 distinct things. So there is mathematical and logical intelligence. There is linguistic intelligence. There is emotional intelligence. There is artistic intelligence. There is geospatial intelligence. I'm just giving you a sample. And the idea that very often it seems the way the human brain works is high levels of one kind of intelligence crowd out other kinds of intelligence, right? It's not very often that you get a human being who is really high in all of the metrics of intelligence. So right, you're beginning to get the sense of the complexity here.
Mhm.
And so how hard
interpersonal and external emotional or interpersonal attendance. I forgot the words. Interpersonal intelligence, extrapersonal intelligence, interpersonal, lots of different things.
So Renee, I'm not quite understanding. So is your interpersonal or emotional intelligence, and then there's something else you're asking. Can you
Interpersonal and intrapersonal
ah,
are two
ah, ah. Are they related to each other?
Well, they're two of Howard Gardner's intelligence.
Yeah. So interpersonal and intrapersonal. Thank you, Renee. And yes, right. So my understanding, and you'll forgive me because I'm not fully up to speed on this, is that those two are often uh, potentially closely related to each other in the sense that you're doing something comparable. When you're trying to understand somebody else, you have a theory of them, right? Is one of the ways to put it. I was listening to a song the other day, and I realized that the song was written from the perspective of the person who was in love with the person who was singing the song, but deciding that they couldn't love them anymore. Right. And I just thought, what an interesting vantage to set up for a piece of music. And then, the idea that it's often really useful to see if you can't see yourself from somebody else's perspective, right? That's a really good exercise in interpersonal intelligence that maybe also generates intrapersonal intelligence. What are my motives? What are my flaws? What are my faults? And I feel like we're at risk of spending the whole class on intelligence, and I don't want to do that, but I will point out, right, that what artificial intelligence does, and we're still trying to figure this out, but it's really complex pattern recognition.
Mhm.
And clearly, this is one part of human intelligence, but it's not the totality of human intelligence. And so one of the things that Noam Chomsky and others have said about artificial intelligence is that it doesn't yet appear to have a very good capacity for abstraction. And that a lot of the really important breakthroughs in art or in science or in literature come from a capacity to maybe step back from the details and rethink the problem in a different way, right? So the theory of relativity is often given as an example of this. The theory of relativity didn't solve immediately some kind of pressing problem. It helped us to eventually rethink the very structure of the universe, but it required a level of creative abstraction from current theories. So yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff that the human mind does that artificial intelligence is not doing. That's I think something we need to definitely talk through. But then please note there is a lot of stuff that artificial intelligence seems to be doing very well that the human form of intelligence may not be as good at doing. David, I see your hand. I'm just finishing the answer to Anne's question as best I can, bringing in Renee's comment as well. Right, but yes, the idea that maybe we're still struggling to figure out what intelligence is. And by the way, one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that developing artificial intelligence may help us to better understand what human intelligence is. Because as we try to build a machine that thinks the way we think, we become more explicit about the way in which we think. So Anne, great question. I'm not dodging. I'm indicating the limits of our current understanding.
That was my point. It's just we need to be careful when we're talking about artificial intelligence to keep those two together, that it's
artificial, it's not human.
That it's not human intelligence, yeah.
And so I'll say one last thing, David. Thank you for being patient. The idea that emotional intelligence appears to be somatic. It appears to be rooted in the body, right? And what artificial intelligence is using is a whole bunch of data about what humans say or write. And in so doing, I want to say artificial intelligence is, first of all, derivative, right? It's trying to make sense of what we say. It's not having the experience for itself. Second of all, it is clearly, up until this point, disembodied. And even if it has eventually, through robotics, the capacity to move around the world, which it doesn't currently have, which may change the way it thinks, it's probably not going to have that feeling in the pit of its stomach that something's not right about this situation, right? I imagine many of us have had that sense, right? Or that the person who you care about, something's off about the way they're interacting with you today, et cetera, right? So those feelings appear to be, as best we understand it, rooted more in the gut than in the brain, right? And the brain of the machine is not attached to a gut. So there may be certain limitations in which it's going to have to be purely derivative. There's a term in the literature for artificial intelligence, stochastic parrots. And so stochastic means unpredictable in certain ways. Parrot meaning the bird that, right, says back to you what you say to it. And so as opposed to, right, saying Polly wants a cracker and the parrot saying back Polly wants a cracker, maybe it says Polly wants Cabernet Sauvignon, right? But it in some sense is unpredictably parroting back to us what it has learned from us without ever experiencing what it's like to have a cracker as opposed to a glass of wine. And that maybe limits its capacity for full intelligence. Yeah, and really deep, interesting, important questions. David, thanks for waiting.
Well, first of all, as I think I said last week, I don't like to call it artificial intelligence since it's based upon the extracting patterns from large language models, which are generated by human beings. I prefer to call it simulated human intelligence, but that's just my own personal preference. As far as Gardner goes, his theory is very, very popular. He is probably the single most cited educator in the world.
Oh, really? Okay.
There's one guy in Australia who sort of does other stuff who might be more cited, but Gardner is very, very renowned as an education scholar. His theory, however, has been very, very heavily criticized. First of all, many of the constructs that he puts forth are not easily testable, so we can't really determine whether whether they co-vary with other kinds of intelligence or are completely independent of them. And second, is intelligence, are these intelligences sort of replacing one another? If you have more of one, does that mean you have to have less of another or not? And the second thing is that there's no empirical support for his research. It's largely theoretical, and there's no one, for example, has done what they do in mathematics and has tried to sort out whether problem solving, computational skills, and a mathematical application are all part of the same construct or completely independent. So he's been criticized for that. Uh, Nonetheless, his theories are very, very popular. Uh, my own theory, and a lot of other people think that we shouldn't call them intelligence. They're more like personality traits
Hmm.
uh, or talents, and that we should think of them that way. My own preference is to think that we're all engaged in different kinds of learning. So there's cognitive learning, there's maybe mathematical learning, and there certainly is a whole new field called social emotional learning, and there's a lot of research going on in that, and it's very clear that we have to learn social emotional tasks and activities and practices and the like. So if you put the emphasis on learning, then these things I think are much more important, and we all have to pay attention to them. And some people have a lot of one, but not much of the other. And other people, they all go together. And I guess that's what we call a well-rounded person. But it's a complicated issue, but it's very, very popular.
Yeah. Thank you, David. And I certainly defer to your expertise on this. I'll say just a couple more things about this very quickly. The first is I've heard some of the criticism of Gardner, and I tend to think of Gardner in the same way that I think of Freud, which is the empirical verification of Freud has been, right, at best checkered, right? Most neuroscientists and many psychiatrists and a fair number of psychologists don't actually think that Freud's theories hold up that well. But nevertheless, we continue to talk about ego and superego and id and unconscious and conscious because it's a vocabulary that's very useful for us to make sense of ourselves in the world. And that in some sense, Gardner, even if he can't be empirically verified, even if he overclaims, is furnishing us with the vocabulary that helps us to make sense of learning and multiple
Yeah.
intelligences.
Yeah, I prefer to think of them as, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And there are many, many people in the world who start things but don't finish them. Another one is Noam Chomsky. He's no longer, the king of linguistics, but he certainly started a revolution in it. And then he went on to, what do you call it? Dom domination over third world countries as his area of
Political
study.
analysis, more broadly speaking.
Exactly, and I think that's how we should regard Gardner. He is a deep thinker, and he's caused us to rethink how we think of them. I like to think of them as talents that are malleable, and you can improve them with explicit attempts at that teaching and learning.
Yeah, and that aligns with the philosophical models that I tend to be most impressed with, which uses the vocabulary of capacities and capabilities.
Yeah.
And so, yes, very often in concentrating on developing one capacity or capability, you have to make a choice. I'm going to spend more time on the cognitive and less time on the artistic or the emotional. One more thing in what you were saying, David, and I think it's really interesting, right? The social emotional side of learning. The work by Poland and by others suggests that if you want to ask the question why we have consciousness, right? Nice question. Why do we have an awareness of ourselves and what it's like to be us? That the answer may be that evolutionarily, right, that simple organisms probably don't have that kind of self-awareness. They have maybe sentience, some implicit sense of well-being. We have to navigate really complex social worlds. We interact with hundreds or thousands or millions of people, and to do that, and because we're so dependent on social coordination to survive, we need to have a really strong sense of how we present ourselves to others and how that is going to influence their understanding of us and what we're trying to accomplish with them. And so that maybe the true root of all of this, right, cognitive complexity, whether it's consciousness or intelligence, is that it's necessary to be the kind of social beings we are. And so that maybe social emotional intelligence is the very trunk of the tree of intelligence,
Yeah.
or intelligences, if you will. Um, we've spent a long time on this topic, and I write him still on my introductory slide. Let me, with your permission, move on. And what I would like to do now is actually pivot. And so I started to say 3 topics for today. We spent a fair bit of time on what was going to be the last topic, but now it's turned into the first topic. The intelligence revolution and what that concept means. Maybe, but I doubt it, we'll have time to return to it. But I do want to talk about the war a little bit. And I do think as we enter now the second month of the war, as we maybe begin to see both what's happening on the ground in Iran and also what is happening in the wider world, in the United States, in Israel. And I'm going to apologize for you to you again. I do think that the war between Israel and Lebanon, and I shouldn't say between Israel and Lebanon. Lebanon is desperately trying to stay out of a war with Israel, but between Israel and Hezbollah, which involves a major violation of Lebanese sovereignty, a major incursion into the right territory of the Lebanese state. And it appears a growing plan on the part of Israel to depopulate large portions of Lebanese territory, and in particular to try to force one religious group, the Shia Muslims, further north, further away from Israel, is its own and highly complex and consequential conflict. It could very well destabilize Lebanon as such. Lebanon, which had been doing better recently and which has suffered terribly as a result of Hezbollah and Israel's conflicts on its territory for a long time. It could very well pull Israel into long and potentially quite destructive occupation. It could be a catastrophe for the Lebanese Shia and for the Lebanese Sunnis, the Lebanese Christians, right? Lebanon is a complex patchwork society. I'm not going to talk much about that today. And with apologies, right, because I really want to focus on the part of the war that the United States is directly involved in. And that, of course, is the war with Iran. But let me say this very quickly. Let us say, if the United States stands down, if the United States, in the way that Donald Trump appears to be highly equivocal, but saying on a regular basis, we're accomplishing all our objectives. We only need another week or two, and they'll all be accomplished. What exactly those objectives are also seems to shift, maybe by the minute, or certainly by the day. If the United States stands down, will Iran stand down? And I think that depends in part on what happens in Lebanon, right? Because Hezbollah, of course, is a proxy for Iran, is supported by Iran. Iran, the right Islamic Republic of Iran, sees itself as the shield for the Shia sect within Islam throughout the Middle East, at least. And so the idea that it is not going to simply think that the war is over if the United States and Israel stop attacking Iran, but Israel continues its campaign against Hezbollah in uh, Lebanon. And so, right, these things are very hard to separate, but I do want to focus more on what the United States is doing and then on what its implications are. And so a couple different things to note here, right? Well, it appears that 4 aircraft, 2 planes and 2 helicopters were struck by uh, Iran in roughly the last 24 hours. Right fighter jet, a Warthog, which is a different kind of aircraft, not a high-speed jet, and 2 helicopters that were on the search and rescue mission. The 2 helicopters were not downed, right? They were hit and managed to make it back to base. But the 2 planes were downed. Of course, one pilot is still missing. One pilot has been rescued. The pilot of the Warthog was able to escape and also has been rescued, recovered. And so we seem to be entering maybe a slightly different phase in the war. And I'm going to describe it just for a few minutes. The idea that Iran has withstood the most forceful blow that Israel and the United States can deliver from the air using conventional weapons. That, yes, we can continue to do considerable damage to the industrial or civilian or military or repressive infrastructure of the Iranian regime. But it's not going to be qualitatively different. It will only be quantitatively additional to what we've already done. And Iran, the metaphor here might be like a boxer. You go into a ring against a formidable opponent. You're not sure how much damage their worst blow is going to do to you. And so you're tentative, and then you absorb their worst blow. You're still standing, right? It gives you a certain kind of confidence. That's the worst they can do. Now I know what it is. Now I know how I can respond. And I'm not sure, right? I have not heard any convincing analysis of how to make sense of the fact that we basically, for a month, flew sortie after sortie after sortie over Iran, and they didn't strike any of our aircraft. And then yesterday they struck 4 of them. Right, but something has changed, and it does appear that maybe there was some capacity that Iran was holding in reserve that they now feel that they can start to use. It might just be luck. It might just be something survived the attacks and they got off some good, clean looks. It might be that we got sloppy because we assumed we'd had achieved air dominance, and in fact there was still some capacity left. But I'm inclined to think more generally that Iran is growing more confident, and in part because on the one hand they've survived, the regime has survived, their capacity to fight has survived, their capacity to repress their own population has survived, their capacity to continue to make the Strait of Hormuz non-navigable has survived, their capacity to strike into Israel, not doing a huge amount of damage, thankfully, but nevertheless, their capacity to make Israelis scramble into bomb shelters and occasionally get missiles through, and in particular, their capacity to also damage their neighbors' oil or fossil fuel infrastructure, has survived this tremendous assault. I believe we're up to over 2,000 separate individual targets having been hit by the United States and Israel in the last month, and Iran is still functioning militarily as a regime and in repressing its own population. And I think they think that they've survived the worst that the United States and Israel can do in this mode of the war. And so then the next question, does that mean that the United States is going to have to move to a ground invasion if it wants to do more damage to this regime, if it really wants to change this regime, if it wants to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? And I am looking at the predictions, at the analysis, the idea that there's roughly a 50% chance, according to the prediction markets, that the United States is going to invade, right? Start a ground operation against Iran. I have to say, I'm not convinced. I don't believe it. And so let us hope that the right planning for a ground invasion is more competent, more thoughtful, more attuned to the possible downsides of a ground invasion than the planning for the initial attack was. And in saying that, right, so if I were to think this through, let me do it for you. It would seem to me the thing the United States really wants to do at this point is probably not seize the Iranian uranium, right? Donald Trump, in his address to the nation on Wednesday, declared that it has been reduced to dust. I don't think anybody believes that. Obviously Donald Trump hopes that his supporters will believe that. But having said that, I think what he said is in another sense accurate, which is that it is buried underground, that we do have satellites looking at it, that we can see if the Iranians attempt to extract it from where it's buried, and if so, we can try to prevent them from doing so militarily. By the way, all of that was true on February 27th before we launched this war. That's not a product of this war. That's just a product of what happened in the middle of June in the previous 12-day war. So having said that, right, what we would attempt to do is not get the uranium, not regime change. That involves taking the whole country, which is, right, larger and better armed and more capable militarily than Iraq. And we know how that went. And Donald Trump has come to power as a critic of this kind of creeping war in which you start one thing and it turns into something else. So that what we would use ground troops for instead is to try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, to try to take coastal areas and islands that Iran uses to hold the Strait of Hormuz hostage, right? But having said that, the idea that if we, put ground troops there, and apparently we have about 10,000 troops in the region ready to go, we would have to be able to defend them and then to resupply them. And that frankly, if we leave, let us say 90% of Iranian territory under the control of the Iranian regime, it would be very easy for them to organize a counteroffensive, and we would be in a ground war, and that this would not work, right? That it would result in many American casualties, and very quickly we would be pulled into the kind of campaign I'm saying I don't think Donald Trump wants to be in, which is a campaign to not just hold a small territory of coastal Iran, but to repel attacks coming from the entirety of Iran, which means controlling the entirety of Iran, which means, right, a sustained, costly, time-consuming, and high casualty ground operation. So I think Iran doesn't think that's coming. I don't think it's coming. I hope I'm right. And that means that they also have learned that they can control the Strait of Hormuz, and that the world economy is very sensitive to this, that it's maybe even easier for them to control it than they had thought, that all they have to do is strike one or two ships, and that the insurance companies will pull the insurance, will not insure any ship going through the strait, and then the ships are unwilling to go through, right? Because if there's a 10% chance they're going to get struck, and it's a billion-dollar vessel or a very expensive vessel with very expensive cargo. They're not willing to take the risk that they're not insured against. And so Iran has come to recognize as well that it has an asymmetrical weapon, right? They're not winning this war in conventional military terms. Far from it. They are being decimated militarily. Their capacity is substantially reduced, but not to the degree that it prevents them from rendering the Strait of Hormuz non-navigable. And that is a choke point for the entire world's economy. And that this is something that the United States has no good option to counter. So Iran has not only discovered that it can survive the worst that we can do to it, it has also discovered that it has an effective counterpunch, if you will, a counterpunch that is more powerful than maybe what we have been able to do to Iran. And so at this phase of the war, Iran seems to be discovering that it is in an advantageous position, that it has gained the initiative, that it has perhaps the capacity to retaliate and escalate in ways that the United States cannot answer. This is where, frankly, we thought we were 2 or 3 weeks ago. Iran may have concluded that it's there now. And war, of course, is unpredictable, and authoritarian regimes are brittle, and you don't see the fracture points until they actually develop. But having said all of that, it doesn't look like the Iranian regime has cracked, let alone broken up to this point. It looks like it's maybe reorganizing a little bit with the supreme leader, perhaps a little bit less powerful, the clerics a little bit less powerful, the military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a little bit more powerful, but still functioning, still coherent, still capable of executing strategy and having hit upon a strategy that seems to work. So I'll then pivot a little bit back to domestic politics for a second. Donald Trump on April Fool's Day, on Wednesday, addressed the nation, right? And I'm sorry to say, not a big fan of Donald Trump, but nevertheless, I don't think it behooves any of us when the president of the United States looks foolish, right? And I think he did. So, he tried to bluster into some sense that we were actually doing well in this war. And, if you're counting targets hit, missiles destroyed, ships sunk, factories cratered, sure, the United States and Israel have done a lot of damage to Iran. But, if you're measuring according to the metrics that the Pentagon and Donald Trump himself have been very clear about, getting rid of the Iranian nuclear program, getting rid of the Iranian long-range missile program, getting rid of Iran's capacity to spread terror and disarray to its neighbors, and regime change. I don't think any of that has been accomplished or advanced by this war. I think there's a good argument to be made that Iran will emerge from this war stronger in all of those capacities, that actually the regime has been changed in the direction of becoming more authoritarian, more belligerent, and more confident. And so the idea that I think it's increasingly obvious to all but the core Trump supporters that Donald Trump really can't declare victory in this war, that he didn't outline a exit strategy, right? Where there's a way for the United States to extract its forces from this war, to stand down, and to believe that the world will return to the baseline before the war, as opposed to, right, Iran still blocking traffic through the Strait of Hormuz and the global economy having to deal with reduction in oil, in helium, in natural gas, in fertilizer that it clearly cannot bear. And so let me then say one more thing about the Iranian perspective on this. Up until this point, and I've got a little bit of data on the board about, right, gas prices rising in the United States, mortgage rates rising in the United States. By the way, it's not fully up to date. I couldn't get the fully up to date data and diagrams that worked. So the idea that all of this is happening, interest rates going up, mortgage rates going up, gas prices going up, other prices going up, not because we are actually experiencing an oil shortage right now or a shortage of the other products that have to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, only because we're anticipating one, right? And the reason there is because these ships take a long time to get from the Gulf to where they're ferrying their freight to. But please note that the right stuff that's chugging away to Asia or Africa or India is going to be arriving probably in the next week or two. And then there won't be a next shipment, right? Because it'll take 4 weeks for this to actually manifest as a real shortage. And when that happens, right, the idea that, well, we're no longer anticipating the shortage is really here. These prices are going to continue to go up. Iran believes that it survived our best blow, and we have not really felt the full weight of its retaliation yet. And that within a month, if it still has cut off the Strait of Hormuz, gas prices may be $8 or $10 as opposed to $4 in the United States. Crops may not be planted, and that is going to create food shortages and inflation in food prices all over the world. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is going to be somewhere between a crisis and a catastrophe for many places in the world that can't bear it. For places like Pakistan or Malaysia, for poorer countries that are just not going to be able to compete with the richer countries that will, right, bid up the price and take what they can get, leaving not enough for the poorer countries in the world. Back now to Donald Trump and the speech, and the idea that in a 19-minute speech, he said directly contradictory things, right? So I think we're increasingly clear about the fact that Donald Trump does not have a coherent strategic vision for this war, that he never really had one, that his thinking in the war was that the Iranian regime would collapse in one of two ways, right? The people of Iran would rise up and replace the regime of the Ayatollah with a more democratically accountable, or at least more strategically nationalistic regime, and that would be good for the United States and good for the world. Or if the Ayatollah is killed, other more moderate, more pragmatic people from the regime would rise to the top, the so-called Venezuela model of regime evolution as opposed to regime change. Neither of those things happens, and it doesn't appear that we have a good plan B. And so now let me be clear about what I saw on Wednesday night from Donald Trump's speech. I think this is a man who has been on the offensive almost his whole life. He's an aggressor, he's a bully, he's someone who does not adhere to norms and who takes advantage of the disarray and the fact that when he violates norms that the others he's dealing with or aggressing against still adhere to, it gives him a strategic advantage. Donald Trump has been placed on the defensive by Iran. Iran is violating the norm that the Strait of Hormuz is international, right, waterway not its territory. And I think what we're seeing is Donald Trump is way out of his standard operating mode, and he doesn't really know how to cope with the world he's in right now. John, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself.
Just a small note. You mentioned gas at $4.
Yeah.
I looked through my binoculars and it's $5.99. This is California you're talking to here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm using the national
That's
app.
okay. No, that's fine.
Yeah, and we drove into Manhattan to meet friends a couple nights ago. We took the electric vehicle. So yeah, I mean, and I'll say more about this in a moment. I do think, right, that California's gas price is going to be the nation's gas price soon enough, and that means, unfortunately, that California's gas price is going to be $2 a gallon higher than it is right now, and that it's going to accelerate not just Americans, but especially around the world, the adoption of electric or alternative sources of energy, alternatives to fossil fuel. That one of the lessons of this war is, look, the choke points are too easily tripped. And the regime and the region that the regimes in the region that the fossil fuel has to come from, including the United States, but also obviously the Gulf, are too unstable, too unpredictable to rely on. And so who is going to benefit from a accelerated transition away from fossil fuel? Certainly not the United States. We're the largest producer of petroleum in the world today. China, right? And China is the largest producer of solar panels and wind turbines. And so that in many ways, and let me get back into my slides, I think what you're seeing through your binoculars, John, is the future in a couple different ways. And that's a future in which eventually this war will have benefited our chief global rival much more than it will have accomplished any of our strategic initiatives. So I've indicated that I think President Trump is appearing increasingly incoherent as he heads into an election season. As his party heads into an election season, his approval rating is continuing to be driven down by this. And I think he's increasingly naked, increasingly uncomfortable. I don't know if the Republican Party actually wakes up and recognizes its objective position, which is that it is being damaged by its association with Donald Trump. Yes, he mobilizes the base, and that is something that's extremely important in electoral politics, but he also increasingly repels independents and those who are not part of the base, Republicans who are more traditional Republicans. And this is going to be very damaging to the party as long as it remains a Make America Great Again or Donald Trump branded party. I'll just note very quickly, right? There's this security conference that Britain has organized that it, very obviously excluded the United States from. There's the declaration by President Macron of France that the United States is unserious in the way that it's conducting this war, that it's not behaving as an ally. And then you put this on top of what the Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, said at the Davos Forum a little bit more than a month ago, seems like a long time ago, right, that there's a rift in the global order because the United States no longer supports it, and that we need to start reckoning with this, Carney says to his European allies and friends. And I think this is what we're beginning to see, right, that our hitherto allies are bypassing us as unreliable. And this is going to drive them not just commercially, but strategically closer to China. If it's ultimately China that brokers some sort of resolution to this war, that maybe enriches Iran in the process of reopening the Strait of Hormuz, allows Iran to profit from the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, or I think growing likelihood that we don't just have a 1 month hiatus in our sanctions against Iranian oil, that we're forced to remove our sanctions on Iranian oil as the price of Iran allowing oil to move through the Strait of Hormuz. We look incompetent. We look like we are incapable of strategic thinking. We look like we have a vast overestimation of our own power. I heard one commentator refer to this as a Suez moment for the United States. And so the idea, that in the Suez conflict, it was revealed to the world that Britain really was no longer a superpower and had been superseded. And I think that, frankly, as we think about the implications of this, we need to be thinking about not just Donald Trump and the idea that he entered this conflict engaged in magical thinking and had no plan B, that once the magical thinking, there's going to be quick and easy regime change of one kind or another in Iran, didn't materialize. The fact that there was no plan B is increasingly obvious to the world. This is not the way a mature strategic superpower operates. This is the way a society that overestimates its power operates in the world, and that it is going to drive our allies away from us, closer to each other, but probably also closer to China. But in addition to focusing on Trump, I think we need to focus on the fact that Trump is not once but twice elected as the president of the United States. If it happens once, you could say it's an aberration. If it happens twice, you have to say probably there's something structural going on that generates the conditions in which a man manifestly unqualified to be president nevertheless becomes the leader of one of the most powerful and most centrally important countries in the world. And the idea, I think, larger swaths of the electorate, of the American people, are remembering just how chaotic the first 4 years of Donald Trump were, but the idea that we had amnesia about this. We forgot, something that was only 4 years ago speaks to the, I think, immaturity, or let me put it in a different way. I think it's better to say the exhaustion of the American political system. It's not functioning anymore. And for us to be a superpower, for us to be a reliable ally, for us to anchor a global security system or a system of international institutions and law, we have to domestically be functioning in a way that allows us to generate reliably responsible leadership. And we aren't. So the idea that this shouldn't just be a diagnosis of Donald Trump or the Iran war, that we need to think more deeply about the fact that it reveals something fundamentally dysfunctional about American politics. If we're going to not just survive the next roughly 3 years, fight to win the next election for control of Congress, begin to check Donald Trump, do our best to maintain our civil and political liberties with a president who clearly has no respect for them, well, yeah, we got our hands full. But we also need to be thinking about what we need to do to fix our mode of organizing our democratic politics. It's failing because it's giving far too much power to the oligarchic elite that's failing because it's letting a minority of our population dictate our politics. And even more deeply, I think we just have to recognize the realization that Donald Trump is a chaos engine, the remembering of this, right, is going to, I hope, lead us to learn, well, the Republican Party is not very reliable, is not where we should be investing our hope for the future. But let us not forget, right, that Joe Biden also hung on to power long past the time he should have, failed to recognize that he did not have it in him to win another campaign, let alone serve another term, and that he handed off almost to the perfect person for Donald Trump to defeat, right? And so the idea that the learning that occurs may be in part, let us hope, no more right-wing populist MAGA politicians. They are chaos and we don't need it. But it may also be, boy, neither one of these parties works. And how we react to that as a people, is it by saying we need to fix the system of government that has got us to the place where we have two dysfunctional, non-responsive, non-accountable political parties. And I'm not trying to make false equivalents. I certainly think the Democratic Party has a much more attractive and ultimately successful policy platform than the Republican Party. But having said that, if it can't enact it, if it can't hold on to power long enough to sustain it, that probably doesn't matter that much. What we need to recognize then is that this system is exhausted. It's not working for us anymore. And we need to fix the system. And hopefully the people who want to sustain democracy are able to provide convincing alternatives, as opposed to the people who say, well, the lesson is that democracy doesn't work, and therefore it's time to start an entirely different chapter in our nation's history. I know I went way all over the place. I didn't talk at all about the Supreme Court, but I think we had a good rounded conversation about intelligence, a little bit about Iran. I'll stop there. Thoughts, questions, things you would like to talk about before we call it a day? Yes, Barbara. It is a hold your head kind of moment. Well, we had a nice discussion in the middle. I'm inclined to go get some lunch. Let you guys do the same thing. Good being with you, and be well. I know there's a lot to think about, a lot to worry about. Artificial intelligence, a war, and an exhausted political system all in one day. I'm sorry for laying it all on your shoulders, but it's out there. We need to be thinking about it. Be well, everyone. I'll see you all next Saturday. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, David.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.